those of you who are joining us on YouTube. We were having some audio difficulties since the last Zoom update. So hopefully you guys can hear me. If one of you has my number and can text me, any of you guys that are watching YouTube, just let me know that you can hear me. So at any rate, we will go ahead and get started. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to, welcome to the winter edition of After His Heart Ministries. Yesterday evening, it began to, we began to have some precipitation. And of course, this morning we have a blanket of snow that's just a mess. That's all it is a mess. It's not anything fun or even remotely effective as far as snow goes, but it made a nice mess. Well, so first of all, what I would like to do is do a little bit of recapping. So what we're going to go ahead and do is, okay, Rodney says YouTube is good. Great. Okay. So one of the things that I would like to do is first is jump onto the board. So we'll go ahead and do that. Okay. So an illustration, if you will, of nomadic lifestyle. Okay, I usually draw this tent. One of the reasons I do the dotted line is so that I can show the fourth wall, right? So we have 1, 2, and then of course 3, and then 4 walls, right? You say, well, wait a minute. No, you have 3 walls and you have a door. Well, the thing is that the Hebrew understanding of a door is that it's a wall that moves. Okay, it's a wall that moves. So on the one side we have, okay, let's make sure we have our green and our red going here. So we have our green. As you go into the tent, this is in, right? Okay, and then you have this. Now let's make sure this is red. And you have this is going out of the tent, and this, of course, is out. Now, the reason why this is important is because that's what the door does. It gives an opportunity for people to come in, and it gives an opportunity for people to go out. Now, a couple of things that are important, obviously, in most cases, as you know that I have taught in the past. Let's start with what's inside, okay? So we're going to write that in green. We have provision. We have protection. And we have instruction. Okay? Provision, protection, and instruction, that's what's in. That's why it's in green. The outside, we have what? We have nakedness. We have shame. And we have exposure, right? Philosophically, we have shame. Physically, philosophically, we are naked when we are outside, away from the tent, exposed. Okay, so there's 2 things that are very, very important. The first and foremost is to understand that this is not preferred. Okay, not preferred. Okay, and then this is preferred. Okay, now what I'd like to do is go ahead and we are going to switch over for a moment to the tablet and specifically to the etymological dictionary. And what we're going to do is we're going to put in Responsibility. Okay. So it says the fact or condition of being responsible. So then let's go ahead and jump over to responsible. But I want to talk about this ITY for a minute. The ITY is forming an element making abstract nouns from adjectives and meaning a condition or quality of being. Okay? So the ITY in the English etymology, this is going to be basically Proto-Indo-European, right? Not to be confused with the Eastern side of things, but a very Western part of our speech as English-speaking people. ITY is a condition or state of being in that thing, right? So responsibility is a condition of being in it, okay? That's going to become important. Let's go back into our tablet for a minute. All right, so now we go to responsible, right? Oh, looky here. We have something very interesting going on. We have a chart. So re in Latin does not mean to repeat, but instead to go back. Okay? Spondere. Spondere is to pledge. Okay? So respondere is to answer or promise in return or promise to return. Okay? Then we have responsable, which is what? That's French. Bringing it finally into our English, responsible, right? Or answerable, answerable. Okay, now the key here is what has happened. All of a sudden, here we are this century with modern technology, modern speech, and again, a situation where a word has been adapted to become something else. And what I mean by that is that people think that there is a process of culpability. Okay. So for example, if I say I need to take responsibility for my actions, I need to be culpable for my actions. Okay. But the truth is that it is actually a response given. Okay. And what I mean by that is it's an answer given. Spondere is the concept or the idea of giving an answer. Okay. Getting back to our chart real quick. If we look at this idea to pledge, right? To pledge or make a promise. So what? It's to return. It's a promise in return. Okay. Now, I know that that's not how you think about that word. You think about that word in terms of responsibilities. Oh my gosh, now we have taken responsibility and pluralized it, right? So we've gone from respondere to what? To pluralized responsibilities. So a pluralized state of that condition. The condition of responsibility. So when we talk about responsibility in the English language in modern times, we are talking about the culpability of a human being. For example, I have a responsibility to protect. I have a responsibility to people to give factual information. That's a responsibility of Rabbi Q, right? But the truth is that what it's really actually kind of touching on in the etymology of the word is what? Literally your word or an oath or a vow or a condition of being in the state of commitment to. Okay? That's the principle there. Now, it's obviously you could see where there's some obscurity here, right? You could see where there's some ambiguity here. This is not static. There is a dynamic to this. And so we're not going to sit here and just assign this definition to this. Because obviously today, when we say we need to be responsible, we're talking about we need to be culpable. We need to be attached to the duty of, right? Okay. So responsibility is quite literally your word. Okay? Your word. Why is this important? Because when oaths and promises are made, when commitments are made, there is an element of conditional, or I should say unconditional trust. If a person makes a promise and the other people choose to accept it, they are accepting that on the merit of trust alone. Nothing has proven that that person's word is good or bad. Now, if we're dealing with somebody who obviously we've encountered before and their word is bad, then obviously in our minds, we think that they're probably not reliable. Well, there's that Latin word again, right? Reliable. But what's interesting about it is in that process, what we have is this idea of someone making a commitment to do something. Well, what's interesting about responsibility when it comes to the tent is the idea that one of the reasons why we stay in the tent is to receive provision, protection, and instruction. But here's what I want you to think about. When you receive provision and you refuse to eat, are you being provided for? Yes, you are. Are you choosing not to receive that provision? Yes, you are. You see, the principle is that there is a giver and a receiver, a greater and a lesser, a higher and a lower vessel involved in all of that. There is a provider. Remember when I believe it was Abraham at the test with Isaac named Yahweh the provider, right? Named him a provider. And so now we have provision, protection. Let's talk about protection. Well, one of the things that's interesting about protection is protection only goes as far as the person who's willing to take shelter. If a person is standing out in front of an army and there are arrows coming and they don't have a shield and the person next to them has a shield and they choose not to step behind that person, then they are what? Not receiving protection. Okay. And then the next, of course, is instruction. And this is the most important of the three because refusing provision and protection does not qualify you or disqualify you. But refusing to be obedient disqualifies you, and therefore you will have a reciprocation of disqualification. What do I mean by that? I don't know if you recall, but back before Passover, I preached a message about the idea that basically, if you want your children to be obedient, if you want your subordinates at work to be obedient, if you want your animals to be obedient, if you want the universe to come into order, you yourself need to qualify yourself as obedient. You need to identify yourself with a clear conscience. Remember, Paul stood before the king and said, as is in my power I stand before God and man with a clear conscience. That is the principle. When we talk about principle, we're talking about values in action. Values in action is a principle. And that principle of responsibility is being able to stand before your accusers and deny their accusations. Now, as a very capable human that is valuable, I can probably say that you have fallen into the culpability of guilt requiring mercy on multiple occasions. Because we spend our days in a state of egoism in which we think and we have emotion, and we operate in action through instinctual process of what we think is best for us or right in our own eyes, or we are in a state of what? Bitach, trust in Yahweh, right? And in that process of trust, our ego is suppressed, and we choose to allow ourselves to fall backwards and be caught by the hands of the living God. There's two reasons why this is so important. The first is that when we discuss the idea of responsibility, there is an element of a necessity. If you are going to be in operation in the kingdom of heaven, I'm not talking about those who choose to not be a part of it, but if you are going to operate in the kingdom of heaven, there is a necessity that you receive provision, that you receive protection, and that you receive instruction. And that is going to require, as an element of hospitality, because I will remind you that in a nomadic lifestyle, looking at the Bedouins and other tent-dwelling tribes for information of how Abraham dealt with his clan in a nomadic lifestyle, the tent and its surroundings is hospitality. The camp is hospitality. Hospitality overrode Torah. Hospitality overrode the anguish of vengeance. If an enemy came to the camp, laid his sword before the guard at the gate, and said, "I am thirsty," the clan leader was obligated to give. But in return for that giving, the person receiving the hospitality, now they're still the lesser vessel. They're still the weaker vessel, right? How do we know that? Because at that moment, they're placing themselves under the provision, protection, and instruction of the clan leader. And so when I talk about a lesser vessel, I'm talking about somebody who's in a state of reception, somebody who receives from a greater provision, a greater protection, and a greater instruction. It is the obligation of the lesser vessel to reciprocate and return upon the hospitable treatment a blessing. Whether that be a blessing in terms of saying that next year your wife is going to have a child, or whether that be saying that, or whether that be saying a blessing upon them for abundance, or whether that be going out and maybe working in the field that day, there is a return upon that, which means there is an investment in the hospitality. So going back to our provision, protection, and instruction, we know that there is an investment. Okay. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest reason is because this week's parasha is about the going out of Jacob. Two reasons why this is important. The first of which is that when we're talking about the going out of Jacob, there had to have been a coming in. You see, this week's parasha, and if we go really quick, go to the First Fruits of Zion website, you will see that Vayetze is our parasha. And Vayetze, if we go into the scripture here, you will see that it is the beginning of Jacob's dream. But what's interesting is it says, Jacob went out from Beersheba, went out from. He left the tent where Beersheba was and went to Haran. He left and he went. Okay, so let's talk about this in terms of our illustration on the board. Jacob goes out from the tent. Was he naked, shamed, exposed? There are There are 4 words in the Hebrew language that not only cannot be translated in English, but their true definition has been completely lost. That's tohu, bohu, tehum, and sulam. Void, without form, abyss, and ladder. You need to know that the rabbis forbade the students from studying those 4 words because they're very sacred and mystical. Jacob goes out of the tent, and the first thing that happens is a sulam. Now, for a minute, I'm just going to put out there, if you really need to get your mind wrapped around this, you need to get your idea in your head. And when I say need, what I mean is that this is something you can't pass up. Okay? I'm not going from the point of view that you have to agree with me. I'm saying this is a wisdom you can't pass up. Jacob goes out of the tent, leaves the camp, right? For good reason. He was under duress. Let's go with that. He left in haste. He left out of a matter of safety, of necessity, but he goes out of the tent. Does he encounter exposure, nakedness, shame? No. He has a vision that no other human being has ever even remotely been allowed to encroach upon. He encounters a wisdom that is so intense that when he awakes from the dream, he says, this is none other than the house of God, and names it Beth-El, house of God. Now, here's the intrigue. If that's true, then there is something outside the tent more than just nakedness, exposure, and shame. For a moment, we could look at the whole idea of shuv and bush, right? The pressing towards the tent, the going away from the tent, etc. We could even look at the idea that the word bush means the word shame, right? He was naked and not ashamed, bush, but it's also the word for dry land. Let there be dry land gathered in one place, right? But then in addition to that, we have lavash, the Hebrew word for what? Clothing, to clothe something, to cover something with clothing. So what? The answer to the nakedness and shame is to clothe someone. So we have this great relationship between repentance and putting on your clothes, and we have a great relationship between being outside the tent and being naked. But this is not what happens to Jacob. So we're not even going to mess with all those Hebrew words. We're going to go with a very intriguing thought process that there is a purpose outside the tent that we may or may not understand. There's a few things that you need to know. The first of which is, when you are in your yard as a little child, and there's a fence around your yard, and you were told, do not go outside the fence. You are not told, do not go outside the fence, because you are some sort of subjugated, unfortunate, unfair treated child. But you were told, don't go outside the fence, because number one, you do not have the knowledge and understanding of what's out there, right? You don't know what could happen to a child outside that fence. Your parents have an idea, but they also don't know. And so the stipulation or boundary that is set is simply this. It is not for you to ask the question why you should not go out. Now, what's interesting is on a regular basis, the parents go out the fence, which means, interesting enough, for one person, it is not okay to go outside the fence. But for someone else, it's okay to go outside the fence. And the only thing that's different between the two is experience. Now, here's the irony. You may think that you can go outside the fence, You may think that they're wrong and that they probably don't know what they're talking about. And that may be true. But you, as the lesser, are supposed to be investing in obedience. So as a little child, as you were told, don't do this, don't do that, don't touch, don't say, don't approach, don't go out, you were given that instruction without your opportunity to ask why. Because experience, sooner or later, is going to give you the why, and then you will propagate that same wisdom to another. Now, there's a big difference between advice volunteered to somebody when they don't ask for it and when it's a warning. And there is a big difference between understanding a why and just understanding the sovereignty of an authority figure. The investment of hospitality comes in the form of what? Accepting the provision. I'll bet you, as a child, you openly had an opportunity to go and get into the food, get into the refrigerator and have a snack, get into the cabinet and have a snack. In my case, climb the cabinets and have a snack. But the premise and the information still stays the same. You are receiving it from a greater vessel than yourself. And here's the irony. You don't have a problem investing and receiving, okay? But it has not touched the heart of a human being unless they are raised that way to invest in provision. Which means what? An understanding of what provision is, an understanding of how it works and the dynamics of consumption. Let's talk about protection, the fence. You may think you're able to go outside the fence, but the truth is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're capable of going out the fence or not. You were told not to, which goes into the side of instruction, but what's interesting is still protection. Your responsibility, there's that word, to invest in protection means you have to shelter yourself, which means you have to trust, which means you have to allow to be protected. There are times where you don't want to be protected because you believe that either A, you don't need it, or B, you don't deserve it. We can get into that at another time. And then, of course, obviously, we get into the instruction, and all of a sudden we have what? These rules. Ha-Torah, right? Torah, coming from the root word ra, yad, to throw the finger, right? To point in a certain direction. Go. So when you understand that you are not to leave the tent because of provision, protection, and instruction, and you need to invest in the tent. In other words, you need to dwell in that tent. You need to dwell there and accept the provision and protection instruction you have been provided by the greater vessel, you being the weaker vessel. Case in point is real simple. In ancient Hebrew logic, if you can best me in battle, then I have to become a vassal or a servant of you. Now, if I refuse to do that voluntarily, that can be obligated into service. What I mean by that is that if I don't invest in the covenantal protection of a greater vessel, they can subject me to work. They can subject me to the obligation of that protection, a return on investment, as it were. Sounds kind of exploitive, I know, and probably sounds a little bit extortive, but the truth is what it is that if I can beat you in battle, then I have a responsibility to protect you, but you have to invest in that protection, which means what? You pay tribute. And if you don't pay tribute, you step into indentured service. However many crops it would have been that you worked as paying tribute, you now are going to work in what? You're going to work off your debt because you owe for the protection you've received. Now, some of that can sometimes be involuntary in terms of if a greater nation takes another nation captive. But the premise is that usually happens as a result of not paying the tribute. Okay, so I understand that there's probably a lot of Western social democratic opinions and biases about that thought process. But in the ancient East, that was the understanding, which means that was the understanding of Abraham. So then we definitely need to call into question when the Torah says that it was accounted to Abraham as righteousness when he believed God. We need to understand that his practice of indentured service, tribute, etc., came into play not as whether he was righteous or not. Meaning what? Those were not the issues that came up. Why is this so important? Because you need to understand that as the greater vessel, that means that that greater vessel can whoop you, can defeat you in battle. And most likely, you cannot, A, fend for yourself. You can't provide for yourself. B, you cannot, what? Protect yourself. And C, you have no wisdom. Now, I know that sounds off the wall, but I'm going to make it real simple for you. You can learn from a mess or you can learn from a mentor. You can hear somebody say, hey, you shouldn't do this. It's probably not a good idea. Or you can go and you can learn the hard way. If you learn the hard way, there's two things you need to know. Number one is the authority who you disqualified yourself with, the one who gave you the instruction. And you chose not to elevate into a position of authority, because I'll remind you that authority does not have any power without elevation. What do I mean by that? A general, 4 stars on his shoulders, right? Walks in and says, blah, 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 blah. And the soldiers look at him like, you got to be up at you out of mind, dude. You're gone. Forget it. We ain't doing it. Who cares if he's got stars? If there isn't subordination to the stars, there is no army, right? There is no general. And so he gets elevated into a position and they say, yes, sir, we'll carry out those orders. That's elevation. Therefore, it's important to understand that a person who is in a state of greater vessel is somebody who has been elevated to that position by the weaker vessel, who's willing to receive what? The provision, protection, and instruction. Now, all of that is to get to a single point, that until otherwise specified, you are the weaker vessel. And until otherwise specified, you are to stay in the tent, and you are to invest in provision, invest in protection, and invest in instruction. But Jacob goes outside the tent and does not fall into a state of nakedness, exposure, or shame. And think about why he fled. If he was truly in the state, remember this idea of condition, ITY. If he was truly in the state or condition of shame, then obviously he would not have received this vision. Now, here's something interesting. As we get into this thought process, there's something we have to definitely conclude. Jacob has a bad reputation with Protestant Christians. Protestant dispensational Christians add Jacob to the failures of Torah. The heel grabber, the deceiver. And what has that done to the fires of anti-Semitism? They're swindlers. They take our resources and our money. They marry our women, but they refuse to be citizens. Right? That was the complaint in Mein Kampf. That was Hitler's sentiment, and he propagated it with power through the nationalism. But the principle is that it goes back to the idea that Jacob was a deceiver. Because who said Jacob was a deceiver? Well, interestingly enough, those who are saying that Jacob was a deceiver still to this day. The sons of Esau and the sons of Ishmael. And so as a result of that, now we encounter this idea that there is propagated within the confines of the story of Jacob, a sentiment that he was a deceiver. What's interesting is they try to say, oh, well, Abraham lied to Pharaoh, right? They say, well, Isaac lied to Abimelech. Of course, Abraham lied to Abimelech too. And so Jacob is following the generational curse of his fathers. They say Jacob is a deceiver. They say Jacob swindled his brother. But you don't go to bed at night and see the Sulam, do you? So you can accuse him all day long, but the actual reciprocation of his behavior is evidenced. Remember, fruit is not the action that somebody does, but the reciprocation of the actions that they do, right? So it's basically what they reap will tell you about who they really are. Why? Because that exposes the truth and the level of heart, right? Okay. So in principle, as we are going through the ideal here, we need to understand that we have a very wrong impression of Jacob. He goes outside the tent and sees the Sulam. He doesn't go outside the tent and have nakedness, shame, and exposure. A lot of people think he did, right? A lot of people go, oh yeah, when Jacob fled, he was fleeing for his life because he was a piece of crap, right? He was this horrible person who had deceived and had manipulated and When the truth is that the only people who actually were fulfilling the words of Abraham's promise, the only ones who were actually carrying out the promise that was given to Abraham was Rebekah and Jacob, which says a whole lot about people's sentiment concerning the characters in Torah. Oftentimes we hear things like, for example, when we want to talk about the fallibility of a human, we say, Noah was a drunkard. Excuse me. But first of all, that is a long drawn out process of diagnosis. Getting drunk once does not qualify you as a drunkard. Number two, you're not pure in your generations, but he was. He was. Abraham, the idol smasher, takes 318 men up against 50,000 troops, most likely, maybe less a little bit, maybe more a little bit, because city-states were around 10,000 people. Okay? So I'm going with 5 different city-states coming together in an alliance, and Abraham takes his entire group, his little group, against that entire army, and takes claim to all of Canaan in that one instance. The patriarchs, as we look at them, have some pretty special stuff going on, some pretty amazing stuff going on. A lot of them get a bad rap. Joseph gets a bad rap for having pride. Jacob gets a bad rap for having treated Leah a certain way versus Rachel a certain way versus Joseph a certain way versus Judah a certain way. But the truth is number one, not one of you has seen the Sulam. And you need to think about past, present, and future because it was taken into consideration when that was given to Jacob, if you accept that it was based upon the merit of his behavior, which we could get into. We could say, okay, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us that we might become the righteousness of God. It is an unmerited opportunity. If you operate in the identity of a son of God, it's an unmerited opportunity. And therefore, Jacob received the vision because he was operating as a son of God, because just like Abraham, he saw Yeshua in the future and accepted that premise and walked in that promise. But we can at least say that it wasn't his behavior with Isaac and Esau in terms of merit that qualified or disqualified him from the Sulam. But we can say that the reciprocation of vision comes upon those who what? Who are in the walk, the halakha with Yahweh. Noah walked with God. Abraham walked with God. Jacob walked with God. Remember, Jacob was a man of the tent. Esau was a man of the field. What did Yeshua say? The field is the world. What's in the world? The pride of life, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes. And so Esau was a man of the flesh, a man of the flesh, a man of the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, and the lust of the flesh. Jacob was in provision, protection, and instruction, but he goes out. Vayetze, he goes out. And when he goes out, he does not receive the reciprocation of shame. His guilt, as far as his deception, does not play a role in the reciprocation of this vision, in which he wakes up and says, this is none other than the house of God. None other than the house of God. Question is what was he speaking of? Because the vision happened in his dream. Now, there are some things that are important. If that is true, and if we could accept the model based on that minimal amount of data, in other words, if we could say, since Jacob went out of the tent and did not encounter shame, exposure, and nakedness, then there is a possibility of going out of the tent and not having those negative things be occurring. In what capacity did Jacob leave? Jacob left on the instruction to leave. Meaning what? This qualified authority who's giving provision, protection, and instruction instructs him to leave. Meaning a qualified authority can instruct you to go outside the tent. I want to show you something. In our studies of recent, we have taken a close examination of the letter Chet. And when we look at the letter Chet, remember, this is the letter Chet in the Hebrew. Okay? You may find it in Psalm 119, and it'll say Chetz. Okay? But in general, it is what? The drawing of a tent wall. What are these lines? Those are panels. Okay? Those are panels. Now, when we're talking about panels in a tent wall, we're talking about goat skin, right? Right? With the black fur or the blackness, right? But the principle is that basically those things are laid together in layers like this. There'll be a panel, okay? A panel will overlap that panel, all right? In fact, let's do this a little bit different. We have a panel overlapping a panel, okay? And those panels are held together by glue. That glue is made from bones. Bones that are heated in what? In water. They're boiled, okay? So we're going to say boiled. We'll put it in parentheses. Boiled bones, which makes what? There's a process of skimming the film off the top of the water, and that's what makes the glue. And that is called strong water. And that is the Hebrew letters Aleph, Mem, which is what? What is this word right here? This word is mother. The panels on the tent are held together by Ima. Okay? That is the letter Chet. The letter Chet is a drawing of the panels that are held together by the mother. The letter Chet means what? To separate. And by extension, it means outside. Because why? The tent walls separate the outside from the inside. It's a tent wall. Okay? That is a nomadic understanding of the Chet. Now, why is that important? Well, when we start to get into the parent roots, I will remind you that as we encounter this, that the Chet had a bunch of different roots. By adding one more letter to the Chet, we had different roots. For example, we had Chai, right? Remember that? The separate work. Okay. We had Chad. We had unity, which was the wall door or the door that moved in and out, allowing someone to come in and allowing someone to go out and creating a unity between those who are in the tent and those who are outside the tent. Okay. Okay. So then when we are talking about that letter Chet, we have kind of an obligation to look at some things. So let's start there. Let's start with the premise of this tent wall. Remember all the dynamics of the tent wall. The mother is involved in the tent wall. The tent wall separates the outside from the inside. The tent wall separates provision, protection, instruction from nakedness, shame, and exposure. The tent wall that's held together by the glue, that is the mother, keeps those who invest in the provision, protection, and instruction in the tent. But Jacob goes out. So then we need to investigate, right? We need to understand. Well, our answer is in one of the Hebrew parent roots, okay? So let me go ahead and pull that up real quick and give you some insight. So basically, let's see, how we're going to do this. We'll go ahead and switch over here. And we're going to go into here. What one is this? Oh, okay. We're in now. Okay. So ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to go into I need to put my keyboard up on the screen. Okay. And we're going to go into the Hebrew and we're just going to go Chet and final cough. Okay. And it looks like we're going to go here with that. Okay. And then we are going to go to okay. And so what we're going to encounter here is when we're looking at this parent root, what we're going to encounter is, there it is, right here. What we're going to encounter is this idea of the wall representing the ridge in the middle of the palate, right? And the cough represents the palm or a curved surface such as found on the roof of the mouth. Now, that is the concept or the idea of the dryness, right? The mouth is dry, the tongue sticks to the roof of the mouth, causing the speaker to wait to speak, right? So it's an idea of not being able to speak, okay? But then when we get into the when we're looking at this, the chet a is where we have the dry mouth. So the premise is that there is an idea here that this chet is representing the palate because of those lines, right? The cough is the curve of it, and it's indicating this idea of dryness of the mouth. Well, that's putting the cough on this side of the Hebrew letter, right? Remember the premise of sitting in the place of honor. Remember, the place of honor is to the right side. And so sitting in the place of honor causes that to what augment the thing that is, it causes it to augment the letter. And so when we talk about that process, watch what happens when we switch the letter. Okay. So we have that dryness, we have that stuff going on where the cough or the palm being the curve creates the dryness when you have the hay, which is the breath or the idea of beholding going like that, is causing dryness in the mouth. You can see why they drew it that way. But now watch what happens. Now we have the cough pet, okay? Cough pet. Okay. And when we have the cough het, what we have is we have the pictograph cough is a picture of the palm of the hand. The het is a picture of the wall. Combine these mean palm wall. To correct or chastise with a firm hand. Okay. And so now you can see how that het is creating a discipline. Let's talk a minute about the word discipline. Okay. The word discipline is basically the idea of there being and I'm gonna pull up something else while we're talking. But the principle is the word discipline is the idea of following somebody, right, in their authority. That's where we get the word disciple, right? So discipline is the idea of putting into practice the instruction from authority. We can see how the kaf and the het have this connection with each other, okay? Now, the reason why this is important is because when we're looking at the premise here of the kaf and het, and this is just an example of the het having these things attached to it. Remember, the palm creates the curve of the mouth. That's the sentiment of the ancient Hebrew when he thinks about that. But when he takes the hand and puts it on the other side, then now we have the hand creating a hand wall or a discipline or a boundary, right? And so now you can see kind of how the dynamic plays out with this philosophically when it comes to the chet. Now there's another one that I want to show you. But the idea here is that the chet is not a physical wall, but a philosophical one, just like the fence. Let me talk to you about this for a moment and see if I can't express it in terms of human understanding. Or as Paul says, let me speak as a man. You see the fence as a child. You see the fence. I can't go outside the fence because my mom said I can't go outside the fence, or my dad said I can't go outside the fence. But the truth is that there is a thought process here that it is actually psychological. The fence itself just looks like a boundary. Is it a boundary? No. You can go right outside the gate and you will be in disobedience. So the truth is it's about how you think about the fence that causes the fence to be a boundary, right? Okay. And so when we are thinking about the thought process here, the thing that we need to grasp is the idea that it is still a freedom for you to be disobedient. It is still an opportunity for you to not honor. Okay? Now, let's talk about qualification. When we are dealing with qualification, there is a concept of civil disobedience. Let's discuss that. As a people, as an American people, we have in times past concluded that we would not accept the tyranny of a dictatorship. And we have done a pretty good job of propagating that. But what we didn't really explain in that process is how we sought to understand whether the authority had been qualified or not. And it was based upon social justice. Okay? So if you can identify an authority in your life that has demonstrated that they're disqualified, then there is an element of necessity to not be obedient to that authority. However, if you cannot prove and cannot identify that an authority has disqualified themselves through dishonor or disobedience to the authority over them, your disobedience will be reciprocated. And not only that, but you will be disqualified. So any desire that you have for authority over anything else in your life will be disqualified. Now, this is important because there's a sentiment amongst humans that they are justified in being disobedient because they don't like what that person said. Or they're justified in being disobedient because they don't like that person's political stance. Or they're justified in being disobedient because they have not chosen the path that you think they should choose. I would be very, very careful in that area. I would be very, very careful to think that you are justified in disobedience because of a political stance. I would be very, very careful to think that you are justified in disobedience because you don't like the behavior of your parents, or because you don't like the behavior of a judge in town, or you don't like the behavior of a police officer. As long as they have not disqualified themselves and you can't prove it, you do not have the ability. You are not entitled to the opportunity to be disobedient. Why is this so important? Because the idea of obedience is a philosophical one. And why doesn't play a role. Sovereignty plays a role. When we see Isaac in the Torah portion last week be tricked, was he tricked? Well, there's a lot of speculation that he was not tricked, that he knew exactly what he was doing and he knew why he was doing it. But let's say we go with what the English King James, bless his heart, King James, version of the Bible. And you guys know what bless his heart means in Southern speak. Says that he was deceived. Says that Jacob tricked him. Says that Rebekah rebelled against her own husband. Says that Jacob rebelled against his own father, and they were justified because why? Because Isaac was not giving the blessing to the correct son. Because why? Because Jacob had stolen Esau's birthright. Let's go back to Rebekah's womb. And let's identify that Rebekah's womb said, the older shall serve the younger. Which means what? Jacob would be in the state of the greater vessel. Which means what? Esau would somehow be humbled. And if Esau received the blessing, then Jacob would always be subject to his brother. In fact, if we accept, which I don't, but if we accept the King Jimmy version that says, oh, I didn't know that it was it was Jacob, right? If we accept that, he gave subordination to Esau. But when he said the blessing to Jacob, he gave subordination to Jacob, that Esau would be subordinate to Jacob. Okay. Here's the part that's important. When we are dealing with these Hebrew letters, I need to remind you of something very important. The concept or the idea of what the tent represents, what the vessel is, what the thing that is going to have some sort of reception is, plays a role in the entire process of creation. Why? Because it says in Psalm 8 and in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, that there would be a subjection, that creation itself would be subject to the sons of Adam, that the creation itself would be subject to Adam. And we see that play out in the naming of the animals, right? There's our King James version, speak again, where whatever name Adam gave them is what name they received. When in the Hebrew, it indicates that it's actually what he said they would be is what they became. Now, however much we get into the depth of that mystical thought process, we can at least accept that God brought the animals before Adam with an intention of elevation of sovereignty, which leads us to a very interesting concept of jurisdiction. Why is jurisdiction important? Well, jurisdiction is simply this. It is an authority position given to someone by a higher authority. It is somebody who is willing to tell or have the have it is someone who is willing to have the responsibilities of another, their responsibilities delegated to another. So it's the ability to have somebody carry out duties that are actually yours, right, of authority. That's jurisdiction. Let me tell you some interesting entities who get to have jurisdiction. Demonic powers receive jurisdiction. They receive authority to do damage in your life as a result of reciprocation. What do I mean? I mean that they are appointed to carry out a specific reciprocation upon you through demonic activity. Where's my proof? Do you remember when Yeshua walked up to the demon and the demon said, "What have I to do with you, son of David? Have you come to torment me before it's time?" What did he mean? I have a contract. I have jurisdiction. I have permission to be here. It's not time yet for me to leave. Right? Now, obviously, there's some sort of torment to the demonic process in them not having an opportunity to be involved with the host. He says that. He says, if you come to torment me before it's time, what does that mean? I still have contract with this person. I still have jurisdiction. We know that when the Israelites were disobedient to God, they were what? Put under the jurisdiction of another nation who what? Served another God, which according to Deuteronomy 32:15 was a demon. Which brings us back to jurisdiction again, doesn't it? So why is jurisdiction important? Because the commissioning or the giving of responsibility to someone has a powerful element here. Now, I know that there has been a lot of information given to you here about the tent, about provision, about instruction, about protection, about investment, about elevation, about obedience, about acceptance, about receiving, right? This message is not about any of that. This message is designed, the whole idea behind knowing all that about the tent is to understand why you would ever be sent out of the tent. So when we are dealing with when we are dealing with the tent, there is a premise that we need to invariably get our mind wrapped around, and that's the idea of taming something. Okay. Remember the premise. Okay, so let's work through the process here. So we have this authority figure, right? And they have sovereignty. In other words, you don't get to ask why. You don't get to ask your father or your mother why when you are given instruction. You are not allowed to ask God why when you are given instruction. You don't get to ask why he said that he wanted you to leave the mother and take the eggs out of the nest. You don't get to ask why. You're just supposed to do it. You don't get to ask why you're not supposed to work today. You don't get to ask why you don't eat pork. The whys may come. Don't get me wrong. We have scientific evidence that it is virtually impossible to remove a parasite from pork meat, and that most likely it is going to end up in your brain screwing you up. And those are the big percentages. The little percentages are the ones where people consume pork and it's okay. But that has nothing to do with sovereignty. And you deciding whether or not, oh, well, now we can cook pork, it's safe, is not yours to choose and decide. It is not yours to choose and decide whether or not you should follow a rule or whether or not you shouldn't follow a rule because you know the why. In fact, I'm willing to bet that you ask why so that you can argue the why after the fact. Don't touch the stove. Why? Because it gets hot and you might get burned. Yeah, but you touch the stove all the time. Boom. Manipulation, disobedience, insubordination, rebellion, and therefore witchcraft. And so in that thought process, we need to understand the authority as sovereign. The authority as sovereign in the sense that it cannot be disobeyed. Okay, then we need to accept that the universe itself, remember it says, the man who resists authority resists God. The universe itself is being obedient to its creator by subjecting itself to us. And as we choose to be disobedient, creation chooses to be disobedient to us. Which is why pestilence, wild beasts, and the land itself attacked the Samaritans when they were brought into the land of Israel after Israel was taken away captive. It's why Yahweh said that the people who are in the land are more wicked than you who are going into the land, and the land is going to drive them out with hornets and wild beasts and pestilence and drought. Meaning what? The sky itself would be disobedient to those who were not obedient to Torah. In fact, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 28 that the sky itself would shut itself up. We, of course, immediately philosophize that and allegorize that into some sort of metaphorical idea and not accepting that the sky itself literally is not going to be obedient to you. Okay, so why is this so important? Why is the sovereignty of authority so important? Because when jurisdiction is given from the sovereignty of authority, it is passed down as sovereignty to that person who received that jurisdiction. And now we get to something interesting, and that is the principle of taming, right? Okay. So when we're talking about taming, one of the things that we need to take into consideration is what is the idea here? The idea here is to cause a lesser vessel to come into order or alignment with the sovereignty of the greater vessel. So now let's say that we have a puppy, and that puppy messes on the floor. We teach that puppy not to mess on the floor, but to go outside to use the bathroom, right? That's taming the wildness of the puppy, who is concluding that it's okay to defecate in this spot. The puppy is not asking why when it is disciplined and when it is told not to do it. The puppy learns and is therefore potty trained. If you have a problem with that thought process, then don't train a puppy. If you have an expectation that your pet is going to not scratch your couch, don't think that that's a process where the cat is going to go, okay, help me understand why I shouldn't scratch the couch. You see the premise here? Creation has subjected itself to us and respected the sovereignty that was what? Given as jurisdiction from the sovereign God, from the intensification of all power in the universe. Okay, so when we talk about taming, one of the things that we need to basically get our mind around is the premise of bringing something into obedience through correction, through instruction, through discipline. When we talk about why a person goes outside the tent, we need to understand taming from an ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle. Why tame the animals? Why tame the ground? Why tame the land? Why tame the land? When we are talking about taming, we need to think about our expectation. Because one of the things that we don't think about when we think about taming the land is we don't think about the idea that as it stands, if you are sent outside the tent to work the land, to work the ground by a sovereign, they are telling you to go tame that land. You are given sovereignty. You now become the sovereign of that land. You now become the sovereign of that animal. Now, Abraham could go out of the tent and he could come into the tent as he willed based upon something very, very important, a clear conscience, which has two elements to it. One is an understanding of merit. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. And in that sentiment and in that sense, there is a need to understand that he, what? Was a son of God as a result of Yeshua's merit. It says, Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. Of course he rejoiced. Why? Because that was the moment when Abraham realized he did not have to work for it. He didn't have to work for the right, the birthright to what? To have a relationship with Abba. He didn't have to work for it, right? It is your God-given privilege to be a son of God. And in that process, then we need to understand that Abraham had an understanding of going out and coming in the sense that he did not go out as a result of shame. He didn't go out as a result of guilt. He didn't go out of the tent because of disobedience. He didn't go out of the tent because he was in some sort of rebellion against provision, protection, and instruction. He went out of the tent to tame the outside. To tame the outside. To bring the outside the tent into subjection to the tent. How so? Because he was the clan leader. He was the sovereign of the house. And if he was the sovereign of the house, then it is important to understand that anything that happened concerning the house and what happened outside came into alignment, which is where we get the concept of echad. The chet dalet is the wall door, the unity between the outside and the inside. So now we understand there is a bad outside and there is a good outside. There is a thought process that you leave the tent in shame and sin and disobedience because you refuse to invest in provision, protection, and instruction. That will lead to a reciprocation of shame, disobedience, or shame, exposure, and nakedness. Your clothes will be stripped off of you. You will no longer have the robes of the firstborn. You will no longer hold the position of honor. Right? Boosh, shame. Press away from the tent. The bait sheen, remember the sheen being the pressure of the teeth. Press away from the tent. You will be stripped of your robes. Exposure. You will not have the protection from the heat, the protection from the cold, the protection from the wind and from the rain. because of disobedience, because of a lack of willingness to receive the provision, protection, and instruction given to you as a blessing, a privilege, an opportunity. But instead, now you are what? Exposed. No longer allowed in the tent, no longer welcome, no longer able to sit at the table. Remember, our sacrifices are the table fellowship, the opportunity to again sit at the table as a son, as a ben, as a propagator of the family. And then we have what? So we have nakedness, exposure, shame. Those things do not pertain to someone who has a clear conscience and do not pertain to a responsible human being. They pertain to somebody who has an external locus of control. They pertain to somebody who refuses to have self-control, self-discipline. They pertain to someone who needs external validation. Make me feel better. Entertain me. Make me feel content, loved, etc. Instead of concluding on the interior that you are loved, that you are safe, that you are happy, all of those things. Make me happy. Entertain me. Keep me content. And that person, I promise you, has the twisted mind. And therefore, that person, unfortunately, is evil. Remember, our Hebrew word for evil is just the twisted rope and the human head, the twisted mind. But that means that they're going to wound, that they're going to do damage. That is not who you want to be. Because two things. Number one, being outside the tent in that state will result in a what? In a continued, sequential, consecutive process. What do I mean by that? Your son's son will go outside the tent. Remember, the sins, not the curse, but the sins of the fathers are visited on the third and fourth generation of those who hate Yahweh. What's that hate? It's that turning away on the path. The turning away from the path. What's the path? Ruach in the Hebrew. Remember, Ruach is the prescribed path. That's why we look at it as the wind, because the wind follows a prescribed path. So understand that going out the tent in that sense and in that sentiment and in that process is akin to the Western social democratic hedonistic mindset. You're of the world because you're in the field like Esau. You are not of the tent. You are not a man of the tent. You are a man of the world. And in the world is the pride of life, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes. You have no self-control, you have no self-esteem, and you have no sense of responsibility. Remember, that word responsibility goes back to commitment, a willingness to do. And you say, I will, and you do. Your confession matches your walk matches your confession. If those things are not in place, your days will not be long in the land. What do I mean? Remember, the Abba is the ox's head and the bait, or the strength of the tent. What was the strength of the tent? The main pole that held it up. The Ima is the glue that holds the tent together. What causes the panels to be glued together? That's the Abba and Ima. That is what? That is the mother and father. Honor your mother and father that your days may be long in the land. You want your days to be shortened? Do you want your abundance to be shortened? Do you want your opportunities to be shortened? You want your hours to be shortened? You want to feel like you have no time? You want to feel like you have no sense of ability to process your life? I promise you, it is present in how you treat your mother and your father. Now, let me make some things clear. There is, in this day and age, a concept of a stepfather or a stepmother. I am not telling you not to honor them in what I'm about to say. What I am telling you is that is not who gets the most honor. The most honor is to the bloodline people who propagated you. Now, if you're adopted, obviously, can't do that, right? But what you can do is alter your thinking concerning them. Because one of the things you need to accept, there are two things. Number one is we are completely fallible. In the process of you dealing with your mother and father, which is dealing with the tent, you need to understand they're fallible. You need to understand that just as screwed up as you are, they were and are. And not only that, but you need to also accept and understand that their screwed upness does not entitle you to screwed upness. Why is that so important? Because the family unit itself represents the authority to be able to go outside the tent and not have nakedness and not have shame and not be exposed. Now, here's the crazy part. All of that was just to prepare you for this part right here. The end is declared from the beginning. A single spark on the tinder of a flame can become an entire mountain of destruction. One small, simple spark can ignite an entire forest. Why is this important? Because the end is declared from the beginning. What you used to do, you do now. Why is that important? Because as you grow older and become more experienced, you have more junk involved in your process of how you think. There is two elements to this. One is your childhood, how you began as a child is how you should be now. What do I mean by that? When your mother and father were the only provision, protection, and instruction you had. Second is the vision that you had at the beginning is the vision that you have now. Do you know what people do? Let me tell you what people do. And this is unfortunate. A lot of this is the influence of the poverty cults that were Catholic orders. But the premise is that a person believes that once they become a Christian, they no longer have a right to have abundance. They no longer have a right to enjoy life. They no longer, all of a sudden, the things that were completely okay in their lifestyle when they were a horrible heathen are now not okay. I have met Christians who were encroaching upon the $1 million mark when they were in the world. When it was the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, they were prospering. They were doing amazing things. And all of a sudden they accept Christ, and all of a sudden they are not allowed to do that anymore. They are not allowed to have wealth. They are not allowed to have a good life. Your sin is your sin. Amen. Anytime that you violate Torah, there's a reciprocation. But that does not disqualify you from the birthright as a human. Even our very Constitution and the preamble to it and the Declaration of Independence all communicate the same thing, that we have a birthright to what? Life, to liberty, and to the pursuit of happiness. What does that mean? That means that some humans came along and concluded that you do not have to be some sort of special thing in order to have that opportunity presented to you. Now, I'm not going to get into demographics. I'm not going to get into the concept of race or the concept of a caste system or the concept of social classes, okay? Don't get me wrong. I went to one of the most liberal colleges that you could go to, and I had a bunch of that put into me, and some of it has merit. But I can tell you this. What I'm saying is, when you began to walk this out, you stopped living. Remember, chai is a full belly. Life is a full belly. Death is hunger. That was a Hebrew understanding. It had nothing to do with the expiration of the human body or the beginning of the human body. It had nothing to do with birth and your stopping existing. It had to do with abundance versus lack and decrease. It had to do with prosperity. It had to do with prosperous business dealings. It had to do with amassing wealth. It had to do with having a good political stance. And when I say a good political stance, what I mean is an influence upon politics. And I'm not talking about a vote. I'm talking about if you look back to your lifestyle before you stepped into Christianity, you were pretty happy. There was a lot of good things happening. And there was a lot of things that were not violations of Torah that Christianity said were violations of Torah. And there were a lot of things that were not part of what you need to subject yourself to. The irony is the level of subjection that we bring ourselves to. We whip ourselves. We beat ourselves to death with our conscience over things that are not even forbidden by Torah. And yet, at the same time, we justify our actions in not being obedient to Torah because some men got together and decided they don't have to follow it anymore and claim that God told them that, which would create a very unjust process with God. Why does he tell these people to do it and not these people? And why does he subject these people to discipline and not these people? You are not special in the sense that you have better privilege than an Israelite who was taken into captivity and replaced by the Samaritans. You are not. They are more special than you in the thought process that they were in covenant with God. Did they violate that? Yep. Did they get in trouble? Yep. So what do you think is going to happen to you as you continue to be disobedient and dishonor? If you understood the level of disqualification that we have walked in, as opposed to what we could have, it would blow your mind. We're still farting around in the tent, trying to decide whether we want to follow an instruction or not and ask why, than to understand that there is a greater purpose present and that once you have your meal, once you have a pretty good understanding of protection and you feel safe, and once you have your instruction, you're going to go out and tame the outside. The thing that is destroying people, the thing that is exposing people, the thing that is causing nakedness, the thing that is causing all kinds of chaos and mess, you're going to go tame. No, when Jacob went out of the tent, he didn't go out in shame. He didn't go out in the sense of that he was this deceiver and that's why he was leaving. He went out because his mom gave him instruction to, but when he went out, oh my goodness, the privilege, the opportunity to have that vision. Don't leave the tent until you're told to. Because if you leave the tent before you're told to, you're going to be walking in shame. And that shame will be nakedness, and you'll be exposed before everybody in front of you. But when you're told to leave the tent, when you're given the instruction to leave the tent, You need to go do what you were created to do. And I promise what you were created to do has already begun from when you were very young. Everything that pertains to who you are supposed to be and what you are supposed to do here in the sovereignty of the intensification of all power in the universe started early. Your mind, the way you thought, the way that you did things. Perhaps you were someone who had a sentiment about the world in such a way, and maybe you spoke about it. Well, then rest assured, you're probably going to do that now. You're probably going to go and say, when I look in the night sky and I consider the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars, what is man that you are mindful of them? That was David's humility and understanding that God was sovereign, that he was most powerful, the Almighty. What I'm trying to tell you is that you have already been given what it is that you need to do. And what I'm trying to tell you is that you are clouded by the question of why. And I'm going to put out there that you are also clouded by the limiting beliefs of can I? All you need to do is look back to the days when you were not serving God and look at your prosperity. All you need to do is look back to the days when you were in the world. I'm sorry, when you were of the world. And at that time period, what was your prosperity? What was your, it's astronomically blows my mind that people will walk into Christianity and all of a sudden they don't deserve to be happy. They don't deserve to be loved. They don't deserve to have opportunity. They don't deserve provision, protection, and instruction. They don't deserve any of the things that are the blessing part. Read Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14. That's what you're supposed to have. Obviously, that's conditional upon obedience, and I get that. But the principle is that's what you're supposed to have. And that conditional obedience still doesn't have merit. It doesn't change your status as a high maintenance child of God. High maintenance, why do I say high maintenance? Am I talking about a California Valley girl who is a gold digger? No. What I'm saying is this: when you have high maintenance, that means that care is taken to make sure that you are maintained often, which means he's constantly checking on you. High maintenance child of God. Child of the intensification of all power in the universe. Guys, we don't even know the level of registration that actually comes into in our process because of how finite our brains are. And you think you don't deserve it. Or you think you are somehow entitled to it. That's the other side of this thing. Is people go, oh yeah, I deserve that. No, you don't. You don't deserve anything that you have been given. But you are given it out of the sovereignty of the intensification of all power in the universe, who grants to those who are obedient to him a reciprocation of obedience, and grants to those who are disobedient to him a reciprocation of disobedience. And his commandment, his provision, protection, and instruction, his commandment, the fifth commandment, honor thy father and mother, is what? Giving jurisdiction to your father and mother. And what? Giving jurisdiction to you over your children. And what? Giving instruction to you and to your children to what? Invest in provision, protection, and instruction, but also to step into the responsibility of taming the outside in due season. But rest assured, if you go out of that tent before you're supposed to, if you enter a season before it's time, you will be naked and ashamed. If you wait until the instruction is given and go outside the tent, then you will tame this world. You will become the change that this world needs, and you will begin to alter the course of humanity. Love it or hate it, it's the truth. And here's the irony. Some of you are still trying to figure out whether you should be obedient or not. Some of you believe that you are entitled to disobedience. I promise you, civil disobedience is a merited action, absolutely present in the history of our nation. But I will tell you right now, it is the premise of it and the criteria of it is not being met. There is no process by which you right now have a right to disobedience. If you will take a moment and you will realize that there are people in your life right now who you think that you are supposed to honor, who are operating in dishonor, then rest assured, just as Yeshua said, if a servant be perfect, he will become like his master. What is he saying there? If the lesser gives exaltation to the master, they will be raised up into the position of master like their master. Let me tell you, there's a side of that that's really good, right? But you need to realize that if you are giving honor where honor is not due, you will reciprocate the same. You need to understand what that means. You need to understand that you will be treated with dishonor. Now, when I mentioned the mother and father earlier and talked about step-parents, I need to take a moment to disqualify the step-parents. And there's a reason for this. Your mother carried you. Now, I know that there is all kinds of junk going on in this world, and that it can come across and arrive at a point where your mother appears to be disqualified. But I will remind you what I said earlier. There is no criteria for civil disobedience. Apart from absolute endangerment and a necessity to defend yourself, absolute neglect and a necessity to seek provision somewhere else. Apart from any of those things, you need to understand that your mother carried you. But I'm going to take it a step farther. Your father made you. And so I understand that this can get into some depth here, right? This can get into a lot of hurt, a lot of wounds that you need to heal from anyways, but a lot of hurt and a lot of wounds. Because I'll remind you, what takes you away from your potential to be what you were created to be are your limiting beliefs, your wounds that you refuse to heal from, and your entitlement. Those are what's damaging you, what's preventing you from being an effective human being, and what's causing you to be the problem and not the solution. I know that there are going to be a necessity for a healing of wounds. I know that there's going to be a necessity to disassociate your brain from all the junk that has happened and accept that you were given an instruction by the intensification of all power in the universe, and there was no exception put in that clause. It says, honor your mother and father, that your days may be long in the land. It doesn't say, honor your mother if she's nice to you. Honor your mother if you agree with what she's saying. Honor your mother if she has said, or if she has demonstrated that she is, in your opinion, in right standing with God, or in your opinion, in alignment with Torah. It is honor your mother and father. The same goes for your father. And I will tell you, I'm going to share with you something. It wasn't until very recently, and I'm talking within the last 2 years, that I met a man who I have identified as qualified as being a good father, in my opinion. Before that time, there was, for my frame of reference, no good fathers. I was a horrible father. My father was a horrible father. His father was a horrible father. Every man I met was a horrible father. I would go up to camp, right? I would go up to men's camp and listen to the confessions of the fathers and realize how horrible of fathers they really were. Men who, in my mind, said, I thought, oh man, this has got to be a good dude. This has got to be a guy who's a good father. And come to find out he's closet drinking, endangering his entire family with alcohol. It wasn't until recently that I got to see Yeshua in a man, and that become a model of understanding of a good father. It wasn't until within the last 2 years that I got to see a true, authentic mother. Now, listen to my words, because I'm sitting here saying that they are not my father and mother. Meaning what? My brain has not identified that yet. Meaning what? I still have to grow in honor your mother and father. But what I want you to understand is, as the instruction does not have merit attached to it, you are your mother and father's child. And that causes you to be the weaker vessel. Done. There is nothing you can do about that. There's nothing you can do to change that. There's no course of action you can do to alter that jurisdiction that was given by the sovereign, the intensification of all power in the universe. He granted it through Torah when it says, therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, and thus start the process again. Believe you me, you need to understand, when he leaves his mother and father and becomes a sovereign himself, his mother and father's tent did not change. Until Abraham was dead, Abraham was the clan leader, the sovereign. Was Isaac the right hand? Was Isaac in the position of honor? Meaning he had what? He had authority over the clan? Yes. And it was probably one of those things where there were probably just a limited amount of things where Abraham was like, you come ask me first, but the rest you can do on your own. Why is there a forest fire background behind me? Because you need to understand reciprocation. You need to understand that this choice now will continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. I am disobedient to my parents because they were disobedient to their parents, because they were disobedient to their parents, because they were disobedient to their parents. We have to go back to a time when there was obedience. And that is the time when it stopped, and the generation, the generational sin was visited into my DNA to cause me to be disobedient. Not to be confused with Augustine's hogwash of original sin, but to be understood as instruction to be disobedient, passed down through our DNA, like we talked about last week. Which means what? We need to overcome it. It is a sin. It is a sin. And the strongest conviction that I have had this week on this message has been simply my own behavior with my own family, with my own parents. I've had plenty of confirmation outside of it. But in its simplicity, there's a realization that, yeah, you know what? I honor the Sabbath. I do not take the name of God in vain. I do not bow to idols. And I know who my Elohim is. I know who my God is, but I'm going to tell you right now, I am a very disobedient son. So before you think for a second this message is about you, you need to know where it came from. But I was given it because anything you are given is not your own. Like I said, Jacob had a bad reputation. Jacob seems to have demonstrated dishonor to his family, to his parents. But when you look in the Hebrew and you ask the rabbis, now I know that people have issues with rabbis, partially because they're anti-Semites, but also because rabbis did make some bad decisions over the years. The rabbis say that Isaac saw Jacob, knew who it was, and realized the righteousness of Rebekah and went along with it. Now, there's a few ways that we could go about identifying whether or not someone is deceptive, whether they're evil, or whether they're dark, whether they are somebody who is qualified to be an authority, qualified to have subordinates, all of those things. We need to look at the fruit. What is the fruit? The fruit is not their behavior. The fruit is the reciprocation of their behavior. And the reciprocation of Jacob's behavior was Sulam. But then what do we got? We've got goats, striped, spotted, regular. Every time that Laban would change the circumstances, do the spotted ones, Yahweh would make sure that that's what was born. Is that the reciprocation of someone who is a swindler? People say, "Oh, but he put the pods in front of the goats, and it was aphrodisiac, and it made them mate." Fine, but the DNA and the information on how the DNA works does not guarantee a spotted, striped, or plain goat. Prosperity came to Jacob as a result of the fact that he was what? In a clear conscience. And it is not the English version of the Bible that gives you the understanding or the opportunity that he was in a clear conscience. But what you need right now is a clear conscience. You need to be able to stand before God and man and not be accused of breaking the fifth commandment. Because if you do not expect prosperity. Do not expect abundance. In fact, I will propose to you that it is very possible that some of the poverty that you have fallen into in the past year is a result of your disobedience, or at the very least, your dishonor. Remember, honor qualifies, dishonor disqualifies. Your dishonor of the fifth commandment. Honor your mother and father, that your days may be long in the land. Yeshua repeats it. The only commandment with a promise, he says, or the first commandment with a promise, sorry. If you will do this, then everything you set your hand to will prosper. Because everything you set your hand to is actually being tamed. You go to trade school, you learn to weld, you learn to bend metal, you learn to shape things. That is being tamed by your hand. You write computer programs, you design websites. That is being tamed by your hand. You get a puppy and you teach it how not to poop on your floor. That is being tamed by your hand. You bring a child into this world and you show them how to walk this walk with Yahweh. That is being tamed by your hand. That is a result of honor, qualifying you. That's the key here. This is a scary message when it comes to the level of wounds that we refuse to heal from our childhood. Remember the concept of the question, am I good enough? Did your parents answer that right? Probably not. Am I able? Did your parents answer that? Probably not. I got news for you. That doesn't change their sovereignty. That doesn't change the clan leader's sovereignty. Abraham going and lying to Pharaoh and lying to Abimelech did not change his ability to go and take an entire land away from Chedorlaomer. The land of Canaan was taken away from Chedorlaomer and was in Abraham's hands. All of the land that was promised to Abraham was present in Abraham's hands when he took it from Chedorlaomer. A promise that Yahweh had made when he first arrived in the land. So, moving forward, obviously there's some healing that needs to occur. We need to go and we need to go back and we need to do some reparenting. We need to do some changing. We need to alter our thinking. We need to change the instruction so that our children's children don't have the instruction to be dishonoring their mother and father. Listen, there's a whole list of commandments after dishonoring your mother and father, but I'm going to propose to you that Yahweh stated those in the order in which they had precedence. I am the Lord God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay, that would be like the most and highest priority commandment, right? You, what? Shall not make graven images. Pretty important, I guess, huh? Then the name of God. What does that mean? That means the Yod He Vav He is superseded by don't make graven images. Then Shabbat. I'm sorry. Then Shabbat. Then obedience to parents. Then not bearing false witness. Murdering, adultery, stealing, coveting. You could dishonor your mother and father and commit adultery, and according to the understanding of how that precedent went, you have committed a greater sin by dishonoring your parents. I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready for that. But that's the sin. That's the simpleness of this. It's going to be hard to let go. It's going to be difficult to not carry with you the wounds. But I propose to you that you have no right to them. That's going to blow your mind too. You're not entitled. You are not entitled to carry the wounds of the damage that has been done to you. You are entitled to be healed from it. That's your entitlement. You are not entitled to break the rules or to commit crimes because crimes were committed against you. You're not. You're not entitled to that even if your parents were wrong. And I'm going to propose to you as a parent, I've been wrong. That doesn't entitle my children to be disobedient. So, is there an element of civil disobedience? Yes, of course. There is a time when you do have to dishonor your mother and father. I promise you, it probably will not happen in your lifetime, but there are times when it is necessary. Most likely, It's not going to happen. So don't get in your mind that you ever can be disobedient. Because if you get that in your mind, you basically have already condemned yourself to a life of being in shame and wishing you were back in the tent. You will condemn yourself to a life of not becoming who you were created to be, the tamer of the outside. That is reserved for those who invested in the provision, protection, and instruction. That is reserved for those who received the provision, protection, and instruction. When you realize that fruit is not your actions, but reaping what you sow, then you'll realize that there is a need to accept that when you see things happen in your life and you reap what you sow, you need to look back and start examining. But I'm willing to bet that 90% of you go to the go-tos for Christianity. You go to, I've looked at a woman with lust in my heart. Okay, that's not quite how that whole thing works. But the principle is that you go to murder, adultery, and theft, and lying. Maybe lying. I don't know. A majority of you feel justified in lying. That commandment doesn't really exist in the American culture. But adultery and murder, hating your brother, you're murdering them, looking at a woman with lust in your heart, committing adultery, those we focus on. I have yet to see a sermon really spoken about that talks about the dishonoring the mother and father and honor qualifying and dishonor disqualifying. So how do we honor? Obedience is a given, right? Okay, let's see if we can narrow this down in simplicity. Do what you're told, right? Okay, that's good. But does that necessarily honor? Well, now we get into something interesting. And I know that there's kind of a concept that this has gone long, but truly it hasn't because we started late. I want you to think about the idea that you can be obedient to something without intention and that it actually will not merit a blessing. If you are told you need to honor the Sabbath, what does that mean? That means that you don't do your own thing. You don't seek your own pleasure. That means that you do what it's commanded to do. You have a holy convocation. And before you get any idea in your head that it has something to do with age, go and look back and see Yeshua in the temple when he's 12 years old. What I mean by that is that there is not a premise of there's not a premise that these things take exception according to age. Experience takes exception according to age. But the principle is that if you're told to honor the Sabbath, you do not seek your own pleasure and you don't do your own thing. You don't speak your own words. You speak the words of Torah. You talk about Torah, you midrash, right? You do a mikra, a holy convocation, which is what? A public, and therefore more than one person, discussion or reading about Torah. Nowhere in there are the other things that you do on Shabbat. Now, I'm not going to sit here and be so strict as to say that you shouldn't do anything else on Shabbat. What I'm saying is that if you are told that you are supposed to honor the Sabbath And so you don't go to work. In fact, here's the funny part is you actually go to your boss and say, I need Sabbath off because I'm religious, right? And your version of Sabbath is going and having leisure time. Well, I got news for you. That was not Yahweh's intention. That was not his process. How do we know? Because that's how we work everything out. As we follow the Sabbath throughout Scripture, we do not see playtime. We do not see leisure time. We do not see recreational time. We see a serious engagement in Torah. And we see a cessation of work. And so you take the Sabbath off, and so you're obedient. You don't work. You go to services and you listen to the sermon, and it's a great suggestion, and you'll take it into consideration. And in that process of being obedient to Sabbath, your heart's not in it. You would much rather be fishing, playing a video game, going on a hike. You would much rather be doing this thing over here. And you can't wait for Sabbath to get over so that you can do those things again. No blessing is coming, I promise you. But if by Friday you are longing for Shabbat, because your week has been insane, and the one thing you get to do on Shabbat is disassociate from the bills, from the stress, from the legal stuff, from the obligations, from the traffic, from the attitudes, from the responsibilities. And you rejoice in the moment that the sun falls, because finally you get to cease from your labors. The blessing will come. What does that mean? That means that there is a merit of intention based upon obedience. And so that's where we get into the concept of honor. You're told, go clean your room. You go clean your room, and the whole time you think about what a horrible parent you had, right? Or have. There's no merit there. But if in your understanding you embrace the commandment to clean your room, and an understanding that things need to be in order, let everything be done in a neat, clean, and orderly fashion, that is the amplified version of 2 Corinthians 14:40, which consequently I had to write 1,000 times when I didn't make my bed one time. But the concept is that basically when you let things be done in a neat, clean, and orderly fashion, you are allowing for order, for light, for a strong mind. Some of you have never had shalom. You've never experienced it. You think you have, but you haven't. You've never had that moment where it was okay for everything to be out of order and everything to be in total chaos and everything to be totally insane, and you still be okay in your relationship with the Father and with a clear conscience, to where no accuser can come along and make a statement that you have done this thing and that you deserve this reciprocation. Because I promise you, there are angels going, did you see that? Are you serious right now? You're going to let him get away with that? I promise you. There's angels going, do you see what he's doing on Shabbat? He told his boss, I need this day off. And he's going and doing that. Where in Torah does it say to do that? Right? So I want you to understand, when you carry out obedience with intention and rejoice in the fact that most likely the instruction you're being given is for your benefit, because remember, Torah is God's teaching and instruction, but the word Torah itself means to instruct, right? Or the instructing of. And when you realize that Torah is a force, an actual energy force moving in a direction, so it has a vector, right? So it's basically got this direction and force moving towards you as a force of benefit in your life. And the Torah of your mother and father is a force of benefit in your life. Then you need to understand that that obedience then can be a rejoicing and not an anguish and not a resentment. I could tell you, when I was a kid, I had this really cool way of dealing with my stuff. And that was that I kept it all out of my toy box on the floor. Because when I did that, I could play with any one thing at once. And I never had to worry about trying to find it by digging through the toy box. In fact, the toy box was empty, so then I could crawl in it and play in it. And my father come in and say, you need to clean this room. And in my mind, I would think, this guy's out of his mind. I got this system going. And I would go in there and I would have everything out, and I would walk through there and step on and break expensive toys. Or I would hurt myself by stumbling over something. Not that I would ever report that to my parents. The point is that I was given instruction to clean up, which was a force of benefit moving in my direction. And I read it as, he's got to be out of his mind, because number one, I'm not digging through that toy box. And number two, I know where everything's at. But the truth is that it was disorder. And me choosing not to honor that not only disqualified me, set me in a state of disobedience, but the result was a washing machine box full of toys in the trash when order finally came. Because order will come. Order will come. Why do I share that with you? Because I want you to understand that we have a logic about how things should be. When the truth is now looking back, I really, really wish that I would have learned better about how to organize. I wish I would have learned better about how to put my toys away. Because number one, I have an expectation years ago that my children would do it, and they didn't. But also, to this day, I don't really have a good handle on it. Torah, whether it's coming from your parents, from the sovereign intensification of all power in the universe, or from a stupid traffic sign, is a force of benefit in your life. Your response to it with a belief that it's a force of benefit and what? A intention of honor to it will reciprocate as blessing, as abundance, as you being the head and not the tail, being politically, financially, and spiritually elite. These are not things you want, then fine. Continue how you've been. But I would ask that you not complain to me when your life is in disarray. Honor qualifies, dishonor disqualifies. When you're thinking about that, I want you to remember there is a merit for disobedience. But I promise you, you will encounter it very rarely in your life. Let every soul be subject to governing authority, for there is no authority except from God. Romans chapter 13, verse 1. For he who resists authority resists God. Romans chapter 13, verse 2. You need to understand that the authority that has been appointed was appointed by the intensification of all power in the universe, and to the best of your ability, through the principle of responsibility. The principle of what? Of bringing back a commitment is based upon the premise of a clear conscience. You literally are stepping into a state in which your accuser cannot speak. Remember, Yeshua asked, and I know it was a gloss, but let's say that we go with that it was true. I don't think it was. I think it's a very cool story, but I don't think it's true. I'm talking about John, where the woman in adultery is caught, et cetera, et cetera. There's way too many problems with it. But looking at the philosophical thought process of it, when Yeshua asks the woman, where are your accusers? What I want you to do is I want you to ask yourself, where are my accusers? Is there anybody right now who can make an accusation before God about you concerning your behavior? And I'm willing to bet that the fifth commandment is in deficit right now. And work needs to be done. Okay? That is the premise. Because if you want to have your life controlled by others, and you want to be steered with a bridle, and you want to be told what to do, and you want to be given the anguish of shame, of guilt, of exposure, then continue. But if you want to do what you were created to do, and you want to become the change that this world needs, you want to become that to this world through a little spark of obedience now, then we probably need to put the fifth commandment back into the 10 commandments. Boy, you think the Sabbath was removed. Look back at your life. There may be those who believe that they have honored their mother and father. Amen. Good. I'm not saying that all of humanity is just a bunch of disobedient kids to their parents. But I'm going to tell you right now, 90% of you needed this message. I know I did. For those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who